Hello, art historians, and welcome to our second lecture over Romanticism, where we're really going to start applying those ideas of the context to the actual art pieces required for this particular unit. And we're going to start here with this work by Dominique Ingres, which is the Grand Odlisque, and I'll show you that name here in just a second. So Dominique Ingres was actually brought up as a neoclassical artist, and he's actually kind of like Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, considered to be a little bit of a bridge. All right, so you have here this neoclassical clarity. All right, so it's very clearly painted, very clear detail, great use of color. And you have a classical reclining nude. So something we have seen plenty of times before. However, right, we are now starting to see that instead of looking at that idea of perfection and rationalism, Ingres doesn't do that. He actually, one of the big critiques about this work of art is that she has too many vertebrae, her head is too small, her feet are too big. She's laying in a very awkward position, almost mannerist. So the way he paints this definitely breaks away from that rationality of neoclassicism. And at the same time, he's very much a romanticist, because he's almost displaying his feelings about a particular thing in the way that he is painting it. And maybe not so much the fact that she is distorted, but maybe this idea that our perception of what is acceptable is distorted. So let me explain. There is a theory that perhaps her body and the way that he paints it is distorted and elongated to make her appear beautiful, but also to kind of show that we had this idea at the time that people outside of Europe were less than. So what we have here is a non-European female, and that is a very important part of this. She is not European, she is Oriental. Oriental at this time just simply means outside, all right? So she's from outside of Europe. And here she is as a harem girl, which basically means she is a sex slave. So kind of like human trafficking at the time, in an Oriental environment, which during this time, people are very curious about what's going on in other countries. So the reason he was able to get away with this very candid nude appearance here is because she wasn't European. So in their mind, it was okay to show her as nude, laying on a bed in this way, because she's not European. But it's not okay. And Ingres was not okay with this. She's turned away, almost trying to hide her nudity instead of flaunt it. The look on her face engaging you is not one of come hither, but it's very much one of kind of despair and reluctant acceptance. Now, how do we know she's Oriental? Well, she has the kind of fan there that she's holding that is peacock feathers, which were not European. Over on the right side, we have a hookah with opium in it, which is Oriental or Eastern. And then we also have these silks and these blues and these colors that were also very Oriental in nature. So neoclassical wise, yes, he paints something very clear. And yes, he paints a classical reclining nude. But romantically, in terms of feeling, he has feelings about this, and she has feelings about this. And we see these women as objects in another country to be painted alongside the hookah and the fan and these sex objects. But in all actuality, she's not. She is distorted in the way he painted her, and our perception is distorted, that this is a human being who is definitely not happy with the position she's put in life. So definitely that bridge between romantic and neoclassical. So a big important thing to understand is the difference between subjective and objective. Anything prior to this that we've seen painted is very objective. The people painted within it are objects. For example, Titian was painting a nude woman. All right, with no opinion, no agenda, no feelings about it. He's just painting it objectively. This is how it would appear. Subjectively, is you're painting how you're feeling or something that you feel something about. And in the Grand Odalisque, that is subjective. The nudity he is showing is subjective. The way she's painted is subjective. It's subject to his feelings and his opinions. And he elongates her in terms of what he views as beautiful. And again, this didn't get people as worked up as Venus of Urbino did, or Rococo, because Rococo was meant to be more private and Titian's work was definitely more public. But it wasn't a European woman. It was a foreign woman. It was far away. So therefore it was acceptable. So this is the Grand Odalisque, all right? He does show a classical nude, but he puts his own subjective spin on it in terms of rationality is not beautiful. He paints the way that he wants to show her as beautiful and long and elongated. And it's definitely not a Venus. It's a nude woman, a harem girl, but it's definitely okay. So there are so many things that are done here to make sure you realize that she is an oriental or outside object, which made it okay. And Romanticism is much more subjective than it is objective. Okay, so this is another romantic painting, which looks nothing in the form and the way it's painted like what we just saw with Ingres and the Grand Odalisque, all right? This looks completely different in terms of how it's painted, but it's painted based on the way the artist felt. He paints the way he feels. He paints things he feels something about, all right? And that is definitely the case here. This is actually when Parliament in England was on fire. So like basically where their Congress meets was on fire, and the bridge going over the river was on fire as well. And you can see down here at the bottom, if you look, there are people not in clear detail, but they're down there watching this burning, and he ran to go paint it and watch it burn. And this is the way that he chose to depict that, all right? And this artist is J.M.W. Turner, which, fun fact, Turner is one of my absolute favorite artists. I really, really like him. His stuff, I actually have a couple paintings of him in my house. Turner paints nothing like Ingres. He doesn't. But he does have a lot of feelings. And there's actually a movie that was just made a couple years ago called Turner, which focuses on how the way that he paints could demonstrate almost his feelings inside. The colors that he uses, the swirls, the way that he uses it, the fact that it's not very clear, it's more painting his emotions in the colors and the urgency and the anger of the brush strokes. He's very dramatic. He's very, very intense, not as much deliberate as intense. And he uses watercolors because watercolors blend a lot more, and feelings blend. They're not clear. There's not a clear line in emotion. You can feel one emotion and that's tinted with another one. And he has lots of feelings, and he's very, very good at using watercolors. He didn't draw anything first. He purely just painted with color in this watercolor style in a very free paint. He wasn't trying to hide that these were brush strokes to make it look photo naturalistic, all right? So what we have here is The Slave Ship by J.M.W. Turner. And I hope you can grasp that Turner, when he painted this, was very, very angry about what he was painting. And he uses the blacks and the reds and the yellows and his free brush strokes to really show the churning of the ocean and the despair over to the left and the setting of the sun in the background. The color was so important to him in how he did this, and the brush strokes that he used could represent his feelings about it. And this, obviously, you can imagine him painting it so quickly, just anger and slashing at the canvas. And this was a event that really, really, really upset J.M.W. Turner. And you can see here in the background that there is a boat that is sailing away. And if you look very closely, you can see hands reaching out of the water. You can see seagulls swooping down to where there are bodies to feed off them. You can see that there's people, these black objects in the water, and those are actually people. So Turner was so angry about a story that he had read during the times of slavery, when African slaves were being taken across the Atlantic on the Middle Passage. If a person who was a slaver had purchased slaves and then gone to sell those slaves, he actually had insurance. He would be reimbursed for slaves that did not return. So if a slave died on the journey over, he would get his money back. But if a slave was sick whenever it showed up, he would only get half the price. So if slaves on a boat were sick or dying, they were thrown overboard off the boat, so that way they could say they died and they buried them at sea, and then the slavers would get their money back. So the way that Turner painted this was to show not only the turmoil and the sadness of like the storm approaching, because these men were thrown overboard into a typhoon, basically, which they weren't going to survive. He's angry about what is happening. He's angry about the injustice of it, and he uses those dark colors and those slashing brushstrokes to really establish that. This is actually just another one of Turner's that I really like a lot, because he was also very passionate about the Industrial Revolution and what it was doing to society. But you'll notice he wasn't as angry about this one as he was more sad. It's not as violent or chaotic in the brushstrokes that he uses. But in this scene, he uses those bright colors to show that the sun is setting on an earlier time. And if you look back here, there's this beautiful old boat that is very vague in its colors. It's very light, and it is being pulled to shore by a tugboat, which is much darker. So this was actually the boat that helped the British defeat Napoleon. And here it is being brought to dock for the last time by this steamboat, basically saying that the sun was setting on this earlier time as we entered the industrial age. And this is just another one I like, the rain, steam, and speed, where he kind of uses those slashing brushstrokes to kind of show the speed of the train approaching and kind of like the fading of the past in the background. Turner's a really good unknown, by the way. It's really easy to kind of pick out a Turner in the way that he paints. All right, so now we're going to look at Eugene Delacroix, all right? And Delacroix is also a typical romanticist. He's got definitely a big heart for different issues. He was a friend of Jericho, and as you can see, he paints absolutely nothing like Turner does. Turner looks completely different, and he also doesn't look as clear as Ingres does. But Delacroix, as a French man, has watched his country go through these growing pains of revolution, where they have a revolution, they become a republic, they cut off people's heads, they kill their king and queen, then they are overthrown by Napoleon, and then they go back to being a king and queen again, and then they have another revolution. It's wash, rinse, repeat. In fact, Les Miserables, the play or the book, was written about their second go-around. So his big heart was for things like liberty, the treatment of lower people, independence movements, end of tyranny, all of that. So for example, this is a scene where he was very upset about how the Greeks were fighting against the Ottoman Turks and the Greeks were being sold as slaves. And this is the massacre at Chios, and it really shows how the Greeks were struggling against the Turkish people. Like, he was just very big on the oppressed. That was a big issue for him. So this here is liberty leading the people, which everything about this shows that this guy has got some classical training, because if you notice, it is very much in a pyramid shape with everything pointing your eye upwards. Even the swords are going that way. The barrels of the gun are going that way, all up towards that French flag, all right? And you have here Lady Liberty, all right, who is leading the people. Definitely this idea of liberty and freedom, and liberty is just busting out all over because her dress is coming undone. And she is leading these people. And you'll notice here that there are so many different groups of people who are fighting in it. So you have all different social classes. You have on the right a young boy who's wearing a school beret. So this is the youth who are being educated in this, who are fighting for it. You see that there is a wealthy man with a top hat. You see a soldier over to the right. You see men who have died right there in front of you, so you can see the injustices. You see the helmet of the French soldiers who have died for this. You see the buildings burning in the background, but everything leads your eye. And if you're a Coldplay fan, by the way, this is on one, I think Viva La Vida. This is his Viva La Revolution, or Yay for the Revolution. That's kind of what this was about. But that's the French flag. And he uses these, sharp, dark colors to show how miserable it was and to highlight those who have died. But then at the same time, it gives that hope of that bright flag up there at the top. So this is Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, all right? And this was when France is in the middle of their second revolution, because after Napoleon died as emperor, they put a king back on the throne because they just went back to what they were doing again. And that king went right away and started taking back all the rights that the people had earned. And in July 1830, there was this uprising against the king. Like, they decided they were going to try this again and have a moderate king who would be a limited government, very much that Enlightenment idea. And what Delacroix said about this is, I have undertaken a modern subject, a barricade, and although I may not have fought for my country, at least I shall have painted for her. In his mind, he was doing his patriotic duty by painting this. He said, 3 days amid gunfire and bullets, as there was fighting all around, a stroller like myself ran the same risk of stopping a bullet as the impromptu heroes who advanced on the enemy with pieces of iron fixed to broom handles. So basically, it was celebrating everybody that came out and fought for this, all the social classes, the young, the old, the rich, the poor. Even if all you had was a blade that you could put on the end of a broom, you were coming out to fight. And these dark colors contrast so much with those bright colors of freedom and independence that they were looking for. All right. So everything about this line, color, it's definitely clearer than you're going to see with Turner, but it's a little bit more chaotic than you would see. It definitely has that Jericho look to it, like the Raft of the Medusa. Very much a romanticist piece of art. Like, he was showing that democracy and liberty and the rights of all people were important, and that everybody in here, he makes sure he shows with the top hat and the rags that they're wearing and the, beret that this kid is wearing. And he's showing a French soldier that has fallen, but also showing a, person who had nothing who was here fighting, that this was for all people and liberty was leading them there. So speaking of anger about governments, all right, we're going to talk about Francisco Goya. And Francisco Goya is also very much a romanticist. However, he's not going to really use paint as much as his medium, as he's going to use graphic arts. So remember, not all romanticists do things exactly the same. They use what they feel speaks through them, all right, and to others. So Francisco Goya is going to be in Spain, and he's actually a lot like Velázquez, who was one of his heroes, because he was a court painter for the royal family. He worked originally for Charles III, who he considered to be a very good ruler. Charles III was enlightened, he was smart, he was good to his people, and then Charles III died. So you get Charles IV, his son, who isn't really as bright or as good of a ruler as his father. So what's going to happen is, while Napoleon is making his way across Europe, Charles IV is basically going to let Napoleon march through to get to Portugal, thinking that Napoleon was such a nice guy and Napoleon was just going to send his troops through and that was it. Completely wrong. Napoleon took over France, put his own brother on the throne, and caused a lot of rebellions between the Spanish and the French troops who had invaded. So Velázquez is a huge hero to Goya, but whereas Velázquez is a little bit more objective, Francisco Goya is definitely a lot more subjective and inserts his own feelings and thoughts into what he's going to paint. One very famous work by Goya is, this is an engraving, or an etching, excuse me, that was "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." This guy, Goya, kind of felt like, feelings are important, and that's great, and imagination is great, but if we don't have anybody thinking rationally, we're going to have problems. And basically what he's showing here is, if you fall asleep at the wheel and all you do is dream and you don't think, that causes a lot of issues. So this guy really appreciates intelligence, not just imagination. And I just think this is one of the funniest things. This is Goya's painting of the family of Charles IV. All right. So the king that he was working for after his original master died, Charles III. This is Charles IV. And Goya does not like this royal family. And the way that he paints them is not reverent the way that Velázquez does. So for example, you've got the queen who looks like she's out of shape. So does the king, who looks like he's got a lost look on his face. Not everybody is looking or paying attention. Some of them look crazy or disturbed. But he does pay homage to Velázquez because he has himself painted into the image, doing what he does as a painter, honoring Velázquez, but at the same time he hides himself in the shadows because he does not want to be associated with this family, unlike Velázquez, who used that mirror to make sure you knew the king and queen were there because he held them in such high esteem. It meant he was a big deal standing there beside them. So just a little bit of a difference here. All right. So when Napoleon invaded Spain to get to Portugal, it was called the Peninsular War because it's taking place on the Spanish peninsula. And Goya at first really thought that Napoleon was going to bring wonderful things to Spain, that he was an enlightened ruler, that it was going to be better for Spain. It had to be better than Charles IV. It could only go up from here. And then Napoleon came in, took the royal family off, put his brother on the throne, and then they started to really suppress the Spanish because the last thing they needed while they were fighting this war was a rebellion from the Spanish. So a rumor actually started that the Spanish were going to kill Napoleon's brother. All right, so out of fear of that, all right, because there had been a Spanish sniper who had shot a French general. So all of a sudden that sparked fear that there was going to be an assassination attempt on Napoleon's brother who was ruling Spain. So in fear that the Spanish were going to rebel, the French troops went out and put down anything that they thought looked like a rebellion. And of course, because of that, the Spanish are also going to rebel. And Goya was appalled by this. He was like, this is not rational. This is all based on rumor and fear and superstition. We have got to think about this. And he created a series, so not just one, but a series of prints called The Disasters of War, which were designed to show people just how horrible all of this was. So the one for the 250 that they picked is this one, and there's nothing can be done. So like this is part of a series where it was be like, this was the invasion, this is what has happened, and there's nothing can be done about it. All right, there's atrocities happening on both sides. And he uses this color of black and white in these prints that he was creating to highlight that central Spanish figure as white. He's pure, he's innocent, he didn't do anything but protect his own country. And he does not give the satisfaction of showing the faces of the people who are doing this because it doesn't matter, because it's a country that's doing it. And they're executing these men just for defending their country. In the background, you can see that they're about to do it again. You can clearly see that the men who are covering themselves are darker skinned Spanish, and the people who are doing the atrocities are lighter skinned as French. So this print in this series was meant to educate people of this makes no sense. We're committing atrocities on both sides. We're killing each other. We could do so much more by working together. And these Spanish people are innocent, and all they're trying to do is defend their country. So this is another series of it, or another one from the series. All right. And you can see here that again, that harsh white against the black is kind of showing the purity and the innocence of these people who are now facing the bayonets that are there pointing at them. All right. And this is another one, which is just absolutely horrible. All right. That this is not only Spanish atrocities, but French atrocities. And this is how war goes. This is the disasters of war. This is probably his most famous, but they didn't pick it for the 250. This is one of his paintings called The 3rd of May. And this is where the French, you can see here on the right, are actually executing these Spanish people. The person who is standing with his arms out is kind of meant to represent Jesus and his sacrifice of, dying for a cause, essentially. People are weeping and mourning, and he uses that spotlight of that white effect to kind of make sure you realize his innocence and to draw your attention to him. And there's this church in the background, but the light has gone out because there's really no hope anymore. And we don't see the faces of the French. We don't want to see that because we don't want to give them a name. We don't want to justify what they're doing. All right, just kind of interesting about Goya. Goya gets worse, and I don't know exactly what I mean by worse as he gets older, but he goes deaf, all right? And he basically gave up on humanity. He's like, reason has left the building. Like everybody's just going based on emotion and belief, and all of these Enlightenment ideas are just gone. And he just really focused the rest of his life on showing just how much society is destroyed by religion and politics and all these things. And in his house, he actually created 16 murals that were created. They call it the Dark House, all right, because he was just showing how bad things actually are. And this is actually a sculpture he did where like pieces of flesh have been carved off of this person, like he's not even a whole person anymore because of what has happened. This isn't on the 250 either, but just to show you how much of a romanticist Goya is and how subjective, like his own thoughts and feelings he's putting into this. This is Saturn devouring his children, because the story goes that Saturn was afraid one of his children would become more powerful than he was, so he ate his own children. And he equated that with governments killing their own people just because they were afraid they would be overthrown. All right, now it's kind of cool because Romanticism is also going to make its way across the Atlantic Ocean, because by this point the Americas are established, and we see the first major art movement to hit the Americas other than neoclassicism, and that's going to be Romanticism. And Romanticism in America had a very strong message to it. So here's what's happened. All right, 1776, America gets their independence, or declares their independence from Britain. The war rages on for a really long time. They finally get their independence. So remember, we're talking about like basically the 13 colonies and like the Louisiana Territory. We have no idea what is really far west yet. We got to wait for the Louisiana Purchase and, not Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark to make their way across to figure out what we have. We have all this uncultivated, untouched earth out here. Well, Britain starts getting a little salty about the Americans who got their independence and starts saying, well, what do you guys have? You have nothing. You don't have all these classical buildings, and you don't have all this art and culture. What do you have except all this dirt out that direction? So being romanticists who appreciate the message that nature can send, they start using paintings of nature to kind of send a message that America actually is great. We are a land of untouched potential. Look at everything that we have. And everything we touch, we make even better. So there becomes the first art school in America. All right. So it's the first kind of school of painting with an, philosophy behind it. And it's called the Hudson River School, which was located in New York. And the Hudson River School focused on teaching its artists to create these enormous landscape paintings with horizons that just seem to keep going. Like they use color to where it fades into the distance because it's limitless, just like America's potential is limitless. It's just going to keep going forever. And America has all of this untouched potential, kind of like that idea of manifest destiny. It's out there. We must go. So if you look at an American Romanticist painting, the detail up front is going to be very clear and very natural. And then it's going to kind of just drift into the distance to seem to go on and on and on forever. And it was our way of saying to Britain, yeah, you've got all this art and stuff, but we've got all of this potential, which you don't anymore. So the work of art for this that's coming out of America is going to be the Oxbow, which is showing a bend, if you look right there, in the river of the Connecticut River in Massachusetts. And you can see that the artist, Thomas Cole, has split this into two deliberate triangles, all right, that make up the entire square. So it's a diagonal line that goes like this, that cuts this scene in half. And on one side, you have this limitless, eternal landscape that just keeps going into the distance, making the color get lighter. So you can see that it just keeps going, just a hint of it in the distance. You see these beautiful flowing lakes. You see right here this the fields and the things that are growing, and there's people fishing, and it's just this limitless potential. But then there is this untouched, rough, uncultivated side with this rainstorm that's passing by, because after the storm leaves this beauty behind it. All right, so the revolution was the storm. But now here is all this beauty that America has left behind, and everything they touch is better. But then you also have, if you look down here very close in the foreground, close to you, you can see the artist's chair. You can see his little umbrella that's showing that he's also one with nature. And nature is harsh and rough and scary. And remember that sublime experience. And this is just very uncultivated and raw and just harsh conditions. But it's okay because we are one with nature. Look, he's even sitting in it, one with nature painting. And by being one with the nature, look at what they do to it. They make it so much more profitable and fruitful because of what they do. So this is Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School, which was a Romanticist school. He lived on a bluff overlooking the Hudson. So he really liked to paint the river and get those vast sweeping landscapes. And I love this quote because he said, "I would not live where tempests never come, for they bring beauty in their train." So he's painting this tempest and this storm. And yes, there are harsh times, but afterwards, look at the beauty it leaves behind. And America has all this potential and all of this ability, and it's vast and endless. And what they touch, they can improve. All right. Okay, so those are the romantic art pieces we're going to cover. And next we will be looking at other romantic mediums such as photography and architecture.